Kyle here from All Media Reviews. I'm gonna do the sports thing that I talked about in the Timberwolves, which I haven't uploaded any of these episodes yet. So the Timberwolves, the thing is with this Oklahoma City team, is this gonna be a dynasty? I don't think it will. I really don't. I think we're gonna look at it as they were really good this 1 or 2 years, and then the league will, part of the league will figure them out, and it will catch up with them. But we'll see. But I mean, that's part of it. Is Oklahoma City, of course, the Oklahoma Thunder came from Seattle. Seattle won one NBA title in '79 with Dennis Johnson and who's the other guy they had? They had one or two other key players. Tom Chambers might have been on that team. He was with Seattle for a while, I know. But anyway, they came close to winning the title with Gary Payton and Sean Kemp in the '90s. They ran into Jordan, of course, but they won the one title. They haven't won it in Oklahoma City, of course, but we'll see. I mean, we'll see if they win. They win. But as far as a Minnesota sports fan, and it supports why I'm such a fan of PGA Tour golf and like the French Open's coming up, tennis too. I don't have to worry about in golf and tennis having my heart broken, having my hopes be be brought up and then to be disappointed. I mean, Charles Schultz, the creator of the Peanuts and Snoopy and Charlie Brown, Lucy, whatever, Linus, Schroeder, all the characters, Woodstock, the famous little comic strip, of course, that showed, and there's like a live action, like an animated version of it, where Charlie Brown's going to kick the football, and like he knows that Lucy has held it for him many times before, and then gets his hopes up, and he's like really hopes he's going to be able to kick the football, kick it a long way. And of course, because she's Lucy, she likes to see him squabble and suffer. She pulls it away after getting his hopes up. He's from St. Paul, my hometown, Charles Schultz. Well, what has happened in the history of sports in Minnesota? Dan Whenesota wrote the book History of Heartbreak, and there's a 90-minute documentary on YouTube. There's several documentaries or videos on YouTube about, especially the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, the Minnesota Vikings did win an NFL title. That make no mistake. They won an NFL title in '69. They might have even actually gotten the Lombardi Trophy at that point, maybe, or whatever. But then they played the Kansas City Chiefs in the actual, like the second Super Bowl, the second or third one. That's the third Super Bowl, and lost. And they won. They went to three more Super Bowls in the '70s, including the last one like the year after, like 6 months after I was born, and lost. And they haven't been back to the Super Bowl since, even though they've had many times they were close. '87, it was the strike year. They were 8-7. They go to New Orleans, underdogs, much worse record. Yeah, it was a strike year. They might have had a better record if they would have had all their players every week, but every team dealt with that. Anthony Carter goes off on the Saints in the wild card round unexpectedly, has like 200 yards receiving. Then they go to San Francisco, the at least two-time Super Bowl champion, led by Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, like in his second or third year, Roger Craig, and they upset. They didn't just upset; they beat San Francisco by like 15 or 20 points. Again, Anthony Carter ran back a punt. I think he ran back a punt in the Saints game too. Basically had his way. He had like almost 200 yards receiving. Unexpectedly, this Vikings team, Wade Wilson and everything, go into the NFC Championship game into Washington D.C. to play the Redskins, and the game was close. Bad weather, of course. Vikings an indoor team playing the Metrodome. Washington outdoors, even though Washington D.C. doesn't have nearly the cold weather that we do here in Minnesota. But regardless, they're an indoor team, and they are driving toward the end of the game. And what happens? A pass is thrown to Darren Nelson. We're at the 15-yard line. They're down by, I want to say, like 5 points. And he drops the ball. He drops the ball at like the 3, and that was on. I think that was on fourth down actually. Is it on? Well, yeah, it was on fourth down. And so they lose, don't go to the Super Bowl. Then Washington goes and beats the Broncos. I don't know if the Vikings would have won, they would have beaten the Broncos, but so then fast forward, whatever it was, 11 years later, 12 years later, Randy Moss, the 15-1 season, they missed the field goal again, try to go up 10 against the Falcons here in the Dome, you know, and losing overtime. Chuck Smith sacks Randall Cunningham, and the Falcons end up going to the Super Bowl, getting trounced by the Broncos. The Vikings might not have beaten the Broncos in the Super Bowl, but 2000 they destroy. I think it was the Saints. Pretty sure it was the Saints in the Dante Culpepper, the Moss's third year, Robert Smith, Chris Carter's final season. I think one of his final seasons, and one of Dennis Green's final seasons. Then they go to New York Giants. The Giants had a one game better record, or like won the tiebreaker, and they lose 41-0 in the NFC Championship game. 2009, Brett Favre comes here. They destroy. I think that game it was the Cardinals. Maybe it was the Cowboys. That was the Adrian Peterson, Sidney Rice, Percy Harvin teams. Um, and they had a really good defense. Allen, Jared Allen, yeah, who's going to be now coach of the Vikings. Anyway, the Saints had a one. I looked at they could have actually ended up beating the Saints if the Saints hadn't won this game in overtime against of all teams the Redskins. But the Saints had the home field that year. They had the one game better record than the Vikings. I think it was the Vikings Favre team that was like I think this Vikings Favre team was 12-4 and the Saints were 13-3. They go and they could have won. They too many men on the field. Favre throws across his body and they lose. I think it was in overtime. Peterson fumbled the ball a couple times. I couldn't watch the second half of that game because we just knew they were going to lose. But and then 2017, they went on the quote unquote Minneapolis Miracle against the Saints, revenge or whatever. What's his name? The receiver that's now with Buffalo, or he was with someone else. Not Sidney Rice. I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, with Case Keenum, who was really a one season wonder, but he was kind of he was ice. He was just so good that year when he came in and replaced. I forget who their quarterback was before that, but who got hurt. Um, but then of course, they go to Philadelphia, and it was very similar to they were ahead 7-0 early in the game, in that NFC Championship game against the Eagles, and of course the Eagles fans were despicable. And that Super Bowl is going to be played here, so they would have been the first team ever to like play a Super Bowl in their home, like host a Super Bowl in their home at their home field. But then they kind of melted down after that second drive, and it was over. It was 41-7. It was very similar to the Giants one 2000. So even like this past year, they didn't get to the NFC Championship game. They went and got 14-3. Won a lot of close games, but we've seen this before. And they end up going on the road because they didn't win the division. They didn't win that game in Detroit like they should have. Sam Darnold was like Case Keenum. He was a little more proven. He'll probably have a longer career, more impressive career, but as we've seen that before. I'm hoping that J.J. McCarthy will be an exception, but I don't believe it until I see it. So the Vikings have, just completely destroyed us. Then you go with the Twins. They won 87-91. They lost in 65. 87-91, though, it has to be mentioned, even though it feels, even though it shouldn't be, slightly not tainted or having an asterisk, but every World Series game they won both those years, they won at home. They lost every road game. They won some road games in the playoffs though, in the ALCS at least, but especially that 91 team their pitching staff was really good, but they did win those, and it was dramatic the way Kirby grabbed Ron Gantz, the ball that went off the glass or was going to go off the glass, then hits the home run. The see you tomorrow night, and then Morris. That 87 was actually a little more special because it was the first time they actually did win. That was the peak of my Twins and baseball fandom. I was obsessed. Even though the team was 85-77, they couldn't win on the road, but they managed to do it in the playoffs. And in Toronto 91 too. But since then they made they made one playoff run. They won in 2002 against the A's. They had that pitching staff, the Twins. Milton, Brad Radke. They had a really good pitching staff, and they had enough hitting with Torrey Hunter and some other guys. But Brzezinski actually. But then they end up running into that Angels team that was like the murderer's row of the 21st century in some ways. That was one of the best hitting teams I've ever seen. Even though they weren't like a massive power hitting team, they had a good Tim Salmon. Jim Edmonds, but they had several other guys that, and their pitching staff was good, but that was the best. That was under Gardenhire. That was like 2000, like the year after Tom Kelly retired. But Then they've had these other playoff appearances where they just disappoint after disappoint almost every year until a couple of years ago when they end up beating Toronto in the wild card series. Would it be? I guess it was like I think it was a 3 game series. They won the first 2 games, and then they ended up going to Houston and they won the first game, then lost. I think the next 4 maybe. Um, but the Yankees, of course. I went to one of the playoff games. Yohan Santana pitched and they lost. There was one Yankee series they played where they won game 1 in New York, but then they lost like 4 straight. But they lost the Yankees how many times? I want to say at least 4 times. But and they had the Bama brothers in 2019. That was the year before that. It was a couple of years that held those home runs. And they ended up losing to I think it was the Yankees in the playoffs. The Yankees had almost as many home runs, but that was the last like season I like had was given hope. Ever since then, even 23 when they made that little run, I watched. But it's like they're pitching really well right now, the Twins. But I just still don't buy it. So then you have like the hockey, of course. The Wild had the one run in 2003 or whatever it was. It was like their third or fourth season in existence with Gabrick. And that was unexpected. It was kind of they did nothing to lose. They weren't expected. They won Colorado, and I forget who they. Then they ended up running into what was it, the goaltender with the Ducks. I didn't think he was that amazing, but they couldn't score on him. And then they've had several like really good regular seasons where they've only won in the playoffs 1 or 2 times. They've had some bad droughts, just like the Twins, really. Not quite as bad, but close. I just think from a standpoint of interest and the way they're managed, the Wild still have they're still young, the youngest of all the teams here, the major team. I mean, you could say the North Stars. The North Stars before that had the one run to the Stanley Cup Finals in '92, and they ran into Mario Lemieux. I actually went to one of the finals games. My dad got tickets, I think, through the company he was working for. They had the one run in '82. Didn't know about them, but they lost to I think it was the Islanders, one of those Islanders teams with Trottier and Mike Bossy, that great Islanders team. So it's like almost every one of these times they could have won a championship, they might have lost to either a more talented team or a team that was just super hot. Um, but the Wild, I still think I sort of I don't care as much about hockey, even though I like hockey. My hockey interest is with my Sega Genesis, but um, at the same time, I give them a slight pass, and I haven't had my heart broken fully with them. So then the last one, of course, is the Timberwolves. Yeah, putting college stuff, the Gopher basketball team, 97 run to the Final Four, and it's all for nothing because they cheated on their exams and papers and stuff. That team was so good, though. I mean, they didn't beat Kentucky. I think they could have beaten Kentucky if Eric Harris would have been healthy. But that UCLA game they won in overtime, I think it was, and then the Clemson was double overtime. But Jackson, Sam Jacobson, Quincy Lewis, Courtney James, John Tom, Charles. They had so many good players for college, But the Willie Burton teams were great too, even though they didn't get the final four. They almost did the second time when they lost to. They beat Syracuse. And they ended up losing to Georgia Tech and Kenny Anderson and Dan Scott. But yeah, the Timberwolves, of course, the history, of course, they were just putrid. They couldn't even win the freaking lottery. They should have had Shaq, although Shaq would have probably jumped ship after 3 or 4 years, and they probably wouldn't have gone to the finals like the Magic did. But I don't know. They didn't obviously get Alonzo Mourning. They ended up with Leitner. I despised when he was at Duke. I didn't like him, but I liked him initially. And then I stopped liking him because I was kind of anti-Duke for a while, and I supported Kentucky. Now I hate both. But no, and then of course they get Garnett, first high school player or whatever. They had Isaiah Ryder, but they have Marbury the next year. And they're like, oh, we have the duo. They're gonna have this long future. These young guys are super young and talented and stuff. And they did make the playoffs Marbury's first year, and then Marbury jumped ship. I was watching a podcast and understand why Marbury. It wasn't to do with money really. He did not want to live here. I mean, you don't say that based your professional who's paying you millions of dollars based on where you're living, but he said he spun out. He fishtailed like several times, and he didn't know how to drive in ice. And so, while he in retrospect, he's like, I don't know if I would do that all over again. When I try to be more sort of responsible. When you're a kid that young, you're kind of just worrying about things. I don't blame him for leaving as much anymore. Not necessarily purely from the money. It wasn't about money. He said, everyone's going to get paid the maximum anyways. It was just paid, and it wasn't that he liked playing with Garnett. He liked the fans here. He did not want to live here, and so it's too bad. But I mean, Ant is from Atlanta, but he's obviously dealt with it. He has other people drive him and stuff. But yeah, the Timberwolves, of course, they had their run after Marbury left. And they made the playoffs several times, but couldn't get out the first round. Then they did finally get Sprewell and Cassell, and um, then they make that run, and then Cassell gets hurt. I think it was the first game or it was the last game of the semifinals against Sacramento. And then they lose the Laker, Kobe and Shaq. Would they? I think they would have beaten Kobe and Shaq because while they were great, they were beatable, and then Detroit proved that. Would they beat in Detroit? That's a different question. I mean, do a simulation, see what it showed like in 2K or something like that. Would the Timberwolves in 2004 defeated the Lakers with Cassell, and with the Timberwolves in 2004 defeated the Pistons team with Chauncey Billups and the Wallaces and Richard Hamilton, Rip Hamilton. But that was, I mean, disappointing. But I felt like the Cassell thing, like the Eric Harris thing with the Gophers, kind of the reason why. I mean, heart was broken, but not so much. So then, of course, they were just not good. Garnett eventually they trade him away and he wins the championship, and we're happy for him to do that. But now the last decade they get the first pick with a couple different times, not just Cat, but with I forget the guy's name. Um, but Cat ends up being maybe a better offensive player than defensive player, but he still ends up being good. The Andrew Wiggins thing they had the year before they traded for him turned up being not quite as what they hoped. They paid him the max and all this stuff, and they trade him away. Then they get the first pick. Rosas. Things change a little bit in the culture the last 5-6 years, and they get Ant and Jaden McDaniel. Some of these guys they end up trading Cat away this past year, and it seems to be working out the second half of the season in the playoffs with Randall, and they run into the first two rounds. Well, it was easier because LeBron's old, Luka's not in shape, and the Lakers don't have much else. And then Curry gets hurt, so they had a little bit of an easy path. But between last year with Dallas, and I feel like if they hadn't run out of gas, but you got to deal with that. They didn't know what kind of endurance they really and stamina they needed for they would they beaten the Celtics? I would guess not, based on the way the Celtics handled Dallas, but the way the Celtics were playing. But would have been nice to see. But losing to Dallas was a missed opportunity some way. And then this year with Oklahoma City again, on paper, are the Oklahoma City a little more reliable? They're a more well-oiled unit, and their record is what it is for was yes. The Wolves won 49 games. They could have won more than that, but then again, they won some games they probably didn't. They could have easily lost, but it's this history of team after team after team. Even the Gopher hockey team lost a couple of years ago in the Frozen Four in the final to a Quinnipiac of all freaking schools. They won two titles 20 years ago. Now it's been 2 decades, but I don't follow them as closely. I was following them a little while, especially when we didn't have a hockey team in the 90s. We didn't have an NHL team, but it's just, is it cursed? The Vikings are the one especially that I think if the Vikings were to win a Super Bowl, all the other teams that don't win or break your heart, it wouldn't really matter as much to a lot of fans like me who like all sports, who follow sports. You do have the Minnesota Lynx, and of course, they lost last year in the final on that kind of missed traveling call that Brianna Stewart, yeah, ended up not getting called for, but the Lynx won 4 titles, 3 or 4 titles. So I think if the Lynx were to win one now, as opposed to the one they were winning them 10 years ago, within the last 15 years, but 10 years ago, it would be more recognized because the WNBA, reluctantly, I'll mention, is probably seen more visibility because of Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark and then Paige too, but I think if the Lynx, and then Lynx are really good. They just handed Dallas, and Paige Becker's 2 losses, and what I watched just the highlights of the second game, but will they win? I don't know. Arguably I would say Nafisa Collier is among, if not the best player in the league. I'd take her right now over Caitlin Clark easily. Caitlin Clark may have more upside, maybe, but she's a better two-way player than Caitlin Clark for sure. Defensive player of the year. But we'll see. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but part of me would like to see them play Indiana in the finals and beat them, or see them rematch against New York again. But yeah, Alana Smith and a lot of the rest of their team is just really good. So, but I don't know if I'm gonna be. I mean, that was hard to take when they lost in the championship series. Then they lost. Well, they won game one, they lost game two, they lost game three, and they could have lost game four here. So it could have been. It might not have even gone back to New York for the fifth game, but it's just the way it is with this town. Is it a cursed? Why do the Twins keep on losing the playoffs and have good teams and losing the playoffs? Why do the Vikings, losing to the Rams this year, having a superior record, although they had lost to the Rams, even though it was a neutral site because of those fires, unfortunately. They're gonna probably there's a good chance they're gonna be resetting the seeding process though in the NFL, where it's not gonna be based on division winners, it's gonna be based on records. So the Vikings would have been the 3 seed, and they would have a home game against Tampa Bay. They wouldn't have been playing the Rams. But no, it's just you just assume the loss, and I just go back to my PGA Tour and maybe the WTA and ATP tennis and stuff like that, and just say, no matter if they have a really great season and a really great record, they're gonna disappoint you until it changes. Again, if the Vikings win, and I can see it snowballing, like the Red Sox, of course, and the Cubs. Although the Cubs only won the one World Series, they haven't been back to the World Series since 2016. But they did get that sort of drought ended. The Red Sox, though, got to the World Series 3 or 4 times in a century, but they what was it 1913 or something? It was with Babe Ruth 1914, and then they got there in like the 30s and 46 with Williams, and then I think they got there once with Yastrzemski in the 60s maybe, and then the 75 year against the Reds, that classic World Series, and then 86 with them against the Mets. Um, but then 2004 and the curse ended. After I think that might have been the year they were down 3 games to 0 against the Yankees in the ALCS too. They did it in such dramatic fashion, but since then they've won 3 more World Series. I think two, at least two, maybe three. So the Twins or the more so be the Vikings. The Vikings were to win. If McCarthy actually is the real deal, Vikings win a Super Bowl in the next 5 years. Maybe McCarthy leads them to maybe at least one or two more. And the Vikings suffering, even the ones that are not around with us, you know, can sort of get their payback. They're just them and the Buffalo Bills. While their history doesn't go as far back as the Vikings about losing, they lost the 4 straight. There was a chance last year. It looked like there was a chance the Vikings and the Bills could be in the Super Bowl. That would be the ultimate for my friend John, who spent many time growing up in Buffalo and lives here in Minnesota now. The two most suffering football franchises in playoff history who came close and didn't win it, one of them finally would break their curse. Kind of like if the Timberwolves would play the Knicks. But and I'd like to see the Knicks win. I think the Pacers could end up beating them though. But if the Knicks were to win, if they played the Knicks somehow, they came back in the series against Oklahoma City, either the Wolves or Cat will end up with the ring. So kind of like Garnett. But anyway, that's my history of heartbreak spiel summary of Minnesota sports. It's kind of the way it is. But it's one of those things where I shouldn't let it sort of focus and consume me, but habitually I can't avoid it at this point. So, but thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.